And I just, first of all, say very warm welcome to everybody here to this afternoon's session. My name is Patrick Casement, and this afternoon's session, I'm sort of chairing it as but it's really more of a conversation, is about looking at the ideas, the thoughts, the principles behind regenerative agriculture, and how, in fact, we have known about so many of these things for centuries. Not just generations, but centuries in many cases, and how we have managed to forget them over the intervening period. I've called the talk Forgotten Wisdom, and this is a brief, and it is a very selective tour, really, or history of the ideas. There are certain things I've included, and many things that, of course, I've left out because there isn't time or space to talk about them all. And I'm going to start in 1663, with a man called Andrew Yarrington, who wrote a treatise on clover and the great improvement of soils by clover. And I think this is extraordinary that with this far back, we had someone who had recognized the importance of clover in our agricultural systems. And he was very highly regarded in his local area. He went out and tried to persuade all his neighbors that they should be planting lots and lots of clover. I want to stress, though, that the clover that they were using at this time was Dutch white clover. It was more or less an annual, and so it had to be reseeded pretty much every year. And so it sort of limited the use of clover. I'm going to jump on then to the 1730s, and this man, who doesn't look very much like a farmer, let alone deserve the nickname Turnip, but he was Lord Townshend, or Viscount Townshend, known as Turnip Townshend, because he introduced the sort of notion of rotational agriculture to a large extent. There had been rotations before that, but they depended very heavily on leaving the ground fallow for maybe 1 or 2 or 3 years in a rotation. And he introduced the idea of putting clover and turnips into the rotation. So his 4-course rotation consisted of wheat, turnips, barley, and clover. And the idea was that you could actually keep livestock on the land all the time through the rotation, and at the same time, you could keep the land productive all the time. The livestock was returning fertility to the soil, and the crops then were providing the cash and so on through the system. And this became the sort of mainstay of British agriculture for many years after that, and sort of led the great agricultural revolution of the 18th century. Moving on through that century, we come to a man called James Anderson, not the England cricketer who's just retired, but an economist, a writer, and an agriculturalist who had huge influence on Karl Marx, interestingly. And he introduced the idea of mob grazing. He thought it was a great idea to get lots and lots of cattle together and put them into a sward very quickly and race them, push them on. And we just heard all about how we should be doing that from Greg Judy. James Anderson discovered it in the 1770s. So this is not a new concept at all. He was also very interested in the idea of both soil improvement and soil deterioration, depending on how you managed it, 2 critical features of regenerative agriculture that you have to be aware of. Soon after that, a man called Arthur Young, who was quite an influential and important personage, started doing some experiments on a farm in the east of England. Nearly all of his experiments were complete failures, but he continued his interest in agriculture in other ways, and he toured not just Ireland and Britain, but also France. But he had a huge tour in Ireland over 3 years, and during his tour, he recorded everything in great detail. And among the things that he recorded were the rotations that he saw. And you'll see here that these are what one might call primitive rotations, the first 3 of them. But the thing that impressed him most was Mr. Holmes, who had a much longer rotation involving, again, turnips and clover. And I think this important issue about how much and how you introduce rotations had a very early start, if you like, in the history of agriculture and became more and more important. By 1845, and we've got another local Irish example here, this is John Andrews, who was the agent to Lord Londonderry at Mount Stewart, well, across all his properties in Ireland. And he introduced a model farm at Mount Stewart, And when he gave evidence to the Devon Commission, which was looking into the condition of Ireland in 1845, just before the famine, he pointed out that they had introduced this amazing rotation on the model farm and had remarkable yields. He was a great advocate of using animal manures, so he recognized the importance of them for soil conditioning. He was, however, probably a great advocate for what became known as high agriculture, which is high input, high output, more like intensive agriculture we would call it today. So in some ways he perhaps got it wrong. He believed in zero grazing and then spreading the manure simply because it gave greater control over where and when you put the manure. By 1898, though, we move on a very significant step to Robert Elliot, who wrote this book and introduced the Clifton Park system of agriculture. And this was again about soil fertility, about soil organic matter, building it up. But he introduced the whole concept of multi-species swards. Now, many of these species had probably been used before, but not in a deliberate way. They'd probably been accidental in pasture and so on. Chicory had actually been introduced to the UK from France by Arthur Young after his tours in France. So it was one of the plants. There were several plants involved. Interestingly, most of these are being used today in multi-species or herbal lays. And one of them, though, yarrow, is not widely used. And about 50 years ago, well, perhaps a little bit less than that, when I started farming, I had one or two pastures that had a lot of yarrow in them. And I wondered, I'd assumed at the time that it was a weed, but clearly it had been planted. And one field in particular, which I know had been reseeded in 1959, still had a significant population. And I wonder really why it's been excluded now from mixtures. It obviously had benefits, I think, in terms of the minerals and so on that it contained. And there's a great quote there at the bottom, which I think perhaps you could see, I don't know, about how important the roots are. And the point about most of these herbs, particularly chicory and yarrow and plantain, is how deep-rooted they are. And again, we had that message from Greg Judy and from Niels Caulfield this morning about how important roots are in creating soil structure as well as in soil fertility and bringing up nutrients from deep down. Moving on to the 1920s, this is a pamphlet I found inside a book at home issued by the Ministry of Agriculture in Dublin. And again, it talks how important clover is in the system, should be in grass-based systems. And it points out the increasing use of wild white clover in County Down. And wild white clover is mostly derived from what they call the Romney marsh clovers, which can withstand incredibly intensive grazing. And it's also a perennial. And so it was becoming established in permanent grassland. And it was clear that the farmers, I think a lot of them influenced by people like John Andrews and the Prices at Saintfield, who had set up model farms, were encouraging people to use them. 1924, the book called Grassland Farming, again talking a lot about clover and the importance of clover and swards, but also talking about liming and keeping pH right. Clover and most legumes require a high pH, somewhere between 6.5 and 7, which is well above the average for what we have in Northern Ireland. So there was a clear recognition of the importance of these factors even then. 1940s saw a huge sort of increase in interest and knowledge and expression of that knowledge of regenerative techniques. And a lot of it was kicked off by Sir Albert Howard, who'd been an agronomist and agriculturalist based in India. And he very rapidly realized that he could learn more from the Indians than he could teach them. He was sent there to teach them how to farm. And he realized that they actually understood much more about sustainable agriculture than he did. And he got the whole idea of humus or organic matter in the soil and how important it was brought home to him by their use of composting. He also was one of the earliest people to recognize the importance of mycorrhizal fungi in the soil. So he wrote this book, An Agricultural Testament, which is full of good wisdom and some very interesting comments about agricultural research as well, and how so many researchers at that time anyway focused on only one aspect of it. So a plant physiologist or plant scientist would be looking at how well different strains of clover or grass grew without any recognition of how well the animals that grazed it might perform. And he called for a much more holistic approach to the combination of plant growth and grazing, for example. 41, this wonderful little book came out, Lay Farming, Sir George Stapleton, who had established the Welsh plant breeding station at Aberystwyth. And he was a great disciple of Robert Elliot from the Clifton Park system. He thought this was excellent. But it was written at a very particular time when the Dig for Victory campaign was going on, and vast amounts of permanent pasture were being ploughed up all across the United Kingdom. And he recognized immediately that if we kept on doing that, we would lose soil fertility very quickly. And it was important to insert a grass lay and grazing and livestock into the system. And he wrote this little slim volume, but still incredibly pertinent and full of wisdom now. Soon after that, Lady Eve Balfour, who is the founder of the Soil Association and a great advocate for soil, wrote this little book, Living Soil, again, all about organic matter and returning fertility to the soil. So there was a real recognition that the soil was a living organism at this time. And then a bombshell in America. This man, Edward Faulkner, wrote this book called Ploughman's Folly. And he said, basically, that we were committing serious damage on our soils by continually ploughing them. And it's extraordinary. Here we are, again, saying exactly the same thing, but he was talking about it all this time ago. He was obviously reviled by most of the farmers in America, but also recognized by a few people as potentially changing the whole course of agriculture. And in 48, we had another American, Rodale, who's, I'm sure a lot of you have heard of the Rodale Institute in America. He set it up, again, looking at soil fertility, soil organic matter, returning fertility. And the Rodale Institute has done a lot of really interesting work on rotations, on continuous cover, and so on. 53, we move on to some people actually putting a lot of this into really serious practice. And this man, Newman Turner, farmed in southwest England, and he had the highest yielding dairy herd in the whole of the United Kingdom at the time. And he based his whole system on multi-species swards and strip grazing kale in the winter. His cows were all outwintered. He turned his multi-species swards into silage clamps, which he made in the middle of the field, and then he sowed the kale around it. And the cows grazed the kale in the winter and were given limited access to the multi-species swards silage in the clamp in the middle of the field. And he kept his cows out all the year round, and he had the most fantastic milk yields, mostly from Channel Island breeds as well. And he wrote 2 or 3 books, but this one is the one particularly about the multi-species swards fertility pastures. A very extraordinary man. And another extraordinary book came out about this time, written by a Frenchman, called Grass Productivity. And you haven't read this wrong. It does say rational grazing, not rotational grazing. And basically, what this book is telling us is marrying together the way in which grass grows and the way in which cattle feed and how we need to match the two together. And this was, again, something that we heard about this morning from Greg Judy, this whole concept. And here is André Voisin expounding the whole theory behind this. This is the most dense and difficult book to read, I have to say, so health warning there. But the message in it is absolutely fantastic. And it's it's all really clear science about how one needs to match these two things together. And it's here we have it all thought out in 1957. The foreword for that book was written by an English academic called Cooper, who was a lecturer at Newcastle University and ran their Cockle Park farm, which is well known, and the Cockle Park grass mixes were the standard mixes for grass for many years. And Mr. Cooper, or Dr. Cooper, I'm not sure where, or professor even, and his colleague Norris wrote this book in 1961. It went into lots more editions. Oddly enough, he makes no mention of André Voisin at all in this book, even though he'd written the foreword to the earlier book. But again, he talks a lot about clover and improving grassland through the use of clover. And this was, I think, for many years, a kind of Bible for grass farmers in the British Isles. He was certainly the established authority on it. Soon after that, this book on soil management came out, and it was written largely from a point of view of arable farming, but the authors recognized the importance of leys, that actually continuous arable was bad for their soil, and they recognized various other things. They recognized the importance of lime, the importance of rotation, and the importance of general good soil management. That's really all I'm going to say, because after that we get more or less into the recent period and the things that are more recent than I'm interested in this case. But I would say that all of these people probably missed tricks at various times or got things wrong as well as getting things right. So this book in particular, when I started to look through it again, having not looked at it for about 40 years, I realized that on the section they wrote about runoff and pollution, they said there was serious danger from nitrates, but not to worry about phosphates. You could put on as much phosphorus as you like. They obviously hadn't seen Loch Ness, had they? Anyway, that's all I'm going to say at this stage. So just to give you a flavor of how and what we have forgotten over the years and how far back it goes into our history. There is nothing much new under the sun. But I would say this, that we do know a little bit more about why we're doing these things and how we can improve them and make them better. And things like plant breeding, things like electric fencing, for example, make all of this sort of stuff a lot easier and a lot more within our grasp. So, there's no excuse for not going out there and practicing some of these things. Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to hand over now to Jason Rankin, who's going to tell us, well, Jason will tell you what he's going to tell us, because it is also a great interest. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. And my name is Jason Rankin. I'm strategy manager at Agrisearch, and I also am a dairy farmer from the Arts Peninsula. My talk today, I can't take much credit for myself. I have to thank my late great uncle, who sadly died young. He attended a night course in Grassland, this is his notebook, in 1921. And really, I sometimes think we have to look at where our education has gone, because I think in terms of what he was taught and the fundamentals, I think is missing from a lot of our education today. So my talk is, what have we forgotten? Now, as you're all well aware, you'll have heard this mentioned many times today, strength in diversity. And Charles Darwin, first of all, many years ago, centuries ago, identified the effect of over-yielding and how that could be. And it was common practice in agriculture for many years that in grassland, you would have a diverse crop of many different grasses, many different clovers, and perhaps some herbs as well. But then I suppose what came along, you had the modern perennial ryegrasses, S23, the Haber-Bosch processes, fertilizers, and so on. And we kind of got our solutions out of the bag, and we kind of forgot about all that. I think I have to own up to the fact that with that legacy, I am like my father before me, a fertilizer-aholic, and I think that's the first thing we have to recognise is we can't cure our addiction until we own up to the fact that we are somewhat addicted. We have to start that process of detox. So, as I said, this talk was based on my uncle's night class in Grassland, and it covered a huge wealth of information. So there was soils, drainage, liming, natural manures, artificial manures. Now there was no ammonia or urea in those days. It was things like slag and phosphate. And funny, Patrick said they didn't necessarily get all things right. I did notice that the recommendation for meadow hay was 200 weight of superphosphate per acre. So I think that perhaps was slightly overkill. Crops and cropping, grasses and clovers, what they all did, the functional seeds, farm buildings, right through to account keeping, and obviously, and so on. And so I do sometimes think our agricultural education has sadly forgotten a lot of the fundamentals of why and how things work, and we've sometimes lost that ability to think for ourselves. We've had plug-and-play agriculture, you might call it. And I think we have lost the experience of previous generations. Now, this is a seed receipt from my great-grandfather in 1932. And as you can see, it is almost what you'd call a multi-species mix. There's no herbs in it, but I suspect they would come naturally. But what you do have is 4 different species of grass. So you've got perennial and Italian ryegrass, you've got cockfoot, you meadowfescue, and you have 4 species of clover. You have white clover, wild white clover, and this is actually very reflective of actually what Patrick just said. It's more or less exactly the same mix he was talking about. Red clover and Ulsite clover, which I think is one we probably should be looking again in Northern Ireland, because Ulsite does suit damper conditions. Now, it's a biennial, but I think it's one we perhaps should be looking at again. So really, multi-species swords, yeah, they're all very fashionable now, but is it really an old technology for a new challenge? This is an experiment on a farm in County Down in 1914, so basically the start of World War I. And at that time, while it's a staple now, the perennial ryegrass with a bit of, I think they call it red clover, I think today we'd call it crimson clover, like an annual red. It was cheap, and farmers always like things that's cheap, because it was only 14 shillings and 6pence. Whereas if you wanted to go for the Harrods one, with all the different varieties that they were recommending, and all the different grasses, the clovers and so on, that was 44 shillings. So that was £203 an acre in those days, compared to £68 an acre. In today's money, when you convert that to inflation, what it would be today. So obviously farmers instinctively would kind of think, oh, let's go for the 14 shilling ones. Let's not go for the 43, or the £2 one. That's going to be a lot cheaper. But what they did was an experiment over a series of about 4 or 5 years. So first of all, there was the crop of hay, because you put a new crop in, the hay was the first thing you did. And as you can see, there was considerably more hay in that first year. And then moving on, you were again seeing when they actually grazed sheep on it for the next 4 or 5 years, there was considerably more mutton off that as well. And then they grew a crop of oats at the end, and looked at the yield of the grain and the straw, and again considerably more there. So actually, when they added it all up, despite that extra money that was spent, you were actually way better off. And they actually reckoned you had increased the value of the allowance by £3.15, or £360. So even though you're using a very expensive mix, as it was in those days with all those different grasses, you were actually an awful lot better off. So why even consider moving away from perennial ryegrass? And it has been, I suppose, a modern success story. And I know all of us who have tried more clovers, more different ones, the complexity of it is challenging. Perennial ryegrass and 200 kilos of nitrogen is pretty much bomb-proof and idiot-proof. When you start introducing clover and other things into it, it requires a lot more up here, and it requires a lot of mindset. But we are facing huge challenges over recent years. We're seeing much more grass growth erratic patterns. We're seeing periods of extreme wet, as we've seen this year. Those of us from County Down, okay, maybe not in the last 2 years, but for a few years before that, we're seeing regular periods of dryness. Actually was down in Cork and Tipperary earlier this week, and they're really suffering down there. So drought is hard to believe. Guys in the west have cattle inside because they can barely get on the paddock. There is a chance for this more diverse Swards to actually deliver more. And we've had a culture for the last 40 plus years of maximization. And if you've got a consistent climate and consistent input prices and consistent output prices, that's grand. But when you've got huge volatility in world markets, where you've got a very irregular climate, really is resilience actually becoming a much more important thing for the future. How do we build resilient systems for our food systems and for our farmers? Now, change isn't easy. Farms aren't a super tanker. You can't just turn it on a dime and start dashing off. Change takes time. Soils and swards are much quicker, easier to establish than changing this mindset here. And I know, multi-species swards, you have to develop a certain dock tolerance in your head, which is easy. Clover can be fickle. For example, this year, clover was very late to start. It's going fantastic now, but in June, July, it really wasn't there. And we do have to be adaptive, and we have to relearn those lessons. We can't go back to we can learn the lessons from those past generations. But we have to produce more food for the economy, for ourselves, to service our overdraft, to feed the world, and so on. So it's actually taking what we can and adapting our modern systems so that we can eventually become more resilient, both in terms of our economics and our environment and so on. So it's having to do that. I think one of the big challenges many farmers face, and this was alluded to in an earlier talk, is to have enough headspace to carry this. As I said, this regenerative farming is maybe and these more complex systems are harder in the brain, and you need to think the rewards are definitely there, but actually it's having the support network and so on to do that. And I think the trouble is with a lot of farming systems is farmers are just going around in ever-decreasing circles, head down and very, very busy. So actually having the headspace to implement these more brain-demanding systems, as I would call them, it's a challenge. And I think this is something that we need to think around, and the support networks that are needed. I mean, in Agrisearch, we had a very successful multi-species trip, and with the ARCZero one as well. But I think in both of those, the mutual support network we had in those EIP projects was absolutely vital. If a farmer had just tried those things on his own without that support network, the chances are they would have given up, or they would have lost faith, or whatever. So maybe one day we'll crack it and we'll end the condition, with the addiction. We'll get there. It's a slow process, and so on. But listen, that's a very quick whistle-stop tour of some of the things we had before and where we could go and how we may possibly implement them in our systems going forward. I'll hand over to Jim.
From Jim McAdam, who's going to talk about something that neither Jason nor I have touched on, and that is the role of trees and woodland in agricultural systems. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Okay. I suppose the slides have come up okay. We've never really thought much. We don't really think of the role of trees in grassland farming. I mean, we know plenty in the past about trees and farming. We know plenty about trees, about forestry, about growing trees, and we know plenty about grass, some of it wrong, some of it right, and we're trying to move in the right direction. So what I really want to talk just a wee bit about is the role that trees can play in grassland farming. In other words, farming with trees. What have we forgotten in the past, because there is knowledge there, and what have we relearned? If we think about sort of folklore, and it was always been said that there was an old adage that once a squirrel could have gone from Derry to Cork without touching the ground. And then to make that more local, once a man could have crossed the valley of any of the glens on the tops of the trees, and that a bird could have hopped the length of the glen on the branches. And that was a report in 1823 that was written. If you look a bit closer at that story, there is a bit amount of fanciful talk in it, because if you read actually into the sort of annals of the old annals of Ulster and the annals of Irish farming, you see that really what they were actually writing about in those stories was more likely, they talk about the term open woodland. In other words, Ireland was not densely wooded for trees from one end to the other. A lot of it was this open woodland, where that meant that there was something between the wood, and it was a grassland type, and animals were actually living in conjunction with trees over a large part of the country, and whether the squirrel could jump from those trees to the other is a matter of conjecture. But so agroforestry, if you like, is an old type, or this idea of woodland, grazed woodland, if you like, is really an old concept. So what can we learn from it if we're thinking about where do we go ahead? We really need to have a greater appreciation of the role that trees can perform in our farmed landscape, if you like. For example, we have the example of Augustine Henry, who came from Cookstown, who was a great Irish forester in his day. And he was a plant collector. He measured, photographed, and collected plants from all over the world. And he brought that knowledge of trees to bear in a very fine publication, The Trees of Great Britain and Ireland. And that was where a lot of our knowledge about trees we have here and the variety of trees we have came. So we can sort of look back on that and how they grow. But there is no doubt that in Tudor times we did lose a huge amount of the tree cover that we had in Ireland. And Ireland has lost its wooded landscape and has become one of the most treeless regions of Europe, despite the fact that it's probably the best tree growing conditions there are in Europe. But having trees and farms is really not in our most recent farming culture, as we've seen from, as Patrick talked to, the development of mixed sleighs and grassland and farming, and what Jason was talking about in these hay experiments. Trees didn't feature there. There were probably hedges in that countryside. They're rarely mentioned, but they were important, and we're realizing the importance of them now that they can make 2 fields overall. But the concept of growing trees in pasture was not really, hasn't been in our culture since, over the last 100 years, particularly since the sort of grassland revolution and the grassland intensification. And that was really, we've largely sort of forgotten those concept of those old tree pastures, what they were like, what the sort of biological system they were, and the benefits they brought. So we've forgotten that. So how can we know, or we have an idea that integrating trees into production farming systems could be done and could yield a whole lot of benefits? And really, trees should be part of a regenerative farming future. So that's the point I just want to start at, where we had growing trees, pasturing trees together was part of our history, a long part of our history. We've lost that concept through intensification of grassland. And a group of us, and now this is the history still, if you go back to about the mid-1980s, there were a group of us, and I worked for the Department of Agriculture then and with Queen's. And there was a group of us across the United Kingdom. We're concerned about grassland intensification, and we were looking at ways that we could make intensive grassland more sustainable. That was the area we were getting the benefit for the EU. We were getting huge subsidies. We were getting headage payments. All of those were driving an intensive farming system, which was leading to probably the start of the problems in Lough Neagh and loss in biodiversity, loss in hedgerows, and we were concerned about ways in which we could make grassland farming more sustainable, and we could reduce the damage, if you like, that intensification had caused. So one of those, we were particularly interested in introducing trees into farms. I've just discovered this it's down here that I can see it actually. Life's a lot easier. And just trying to look at that there. So, a group of us got together and were interested in getting trees integrated into farming systems. Now, we knew that the model of simply giving more woodland grants to farmers, yes, it might work in parts of England and bits of Scotland, but in Northern Ireland it certainly wouldn't work. The average farm size then was just over 30 acres. So to get a farmer to give up an acre or two to plant woodlands just for some environmental reason was just a no-go. So our woodland cover was, of course, the lowest in Europe because of that. So we looked at ways in which trees could be integrated into farms that would not affect farm productivity but would deliver environmental benefits. And we looked at models all over the world, and one that we're particularly interested in was in New Zealand, South Island, New Zealand, where there were huge problems with soil erosion because of intensive grazing, sheep grazing on hill country in South Island, New Zealand. And they were planting wide-spaced conifer trees, Pinus radiata, into those pastures the trees grew fast, and they were able to just graze within 5 or 6 months of planting the trees. And they found that the trees were controlling the erosion on the banks, stabilizing the soil, and yet had minimal impact on their sheep production industry. So on that basis, we said, right, let's look at integrating that into the UK and in our case here in Northern Ireland. So we set up this idea of agroforestry, which is an unfortunate word because it really is not a form of forestry. It's a form of grassland farming where you put trees into it, and people are put off by the word of forestry, but it's now become a European recognized land type, so we sort of have to use it from the point of view of description. So we in agroforestry systems, if you like, trees are integrated, are combined with crops and animals on the same unit of land, and in that way they can deliver a whole range of what we call ecosystem services, or just natural benefits that because of the significant interaction of the trees, the pasture, and the crop, or the trees, the pasture, and the livestock. So it's all about integrating trees into farms with minimal impact on the productivity of those farms, and delivering other multiple benefits that trees will do. Just to sort of show it in a graphic, we know, I mean, the basic ecological principle of regenerative farming too is that the more complex a natural system is, the more stable it is. So if you introduce a tree to a grassland system, which is relatively simple, then that level of complexity makes it more stable. And we've talked about the climate challenges that are coming down the track to us. We need to have something that will make our farming more stable, have more stability into it. And trees offer that option. And they do other things in terms of allowing us to continue to produce meat to feed people, and also the environmental benefits focused around the soil and the soil health and the soil properties that those trees can bring to a system. For example, if you put too much fertilizer on that system, it will either run off and end up in the water courses, and the phosphate ends up in Loughney and whatever. But if you have trees there, they open the soil, they make it more porous, and we've proven that from the trials that we've done that I'll just mention over 30 years ago, and that the water and nutrients get down into the soil, the trees' roots mop it up, and they recycle in the system, and you've got a sort of a nature-based solution for what had been a particular problem with grasslands and ones that we're facing now. But that's just one example of it. So the evidence, so we started in the late 1980s, and I think that qualifies, Patrick, probably for looking past, not maybe our ancestors, but it's a brave while ago. Anyway, so we looked at these benefits that this idea of growing trees in grassland can bring. And so that's about 37 or 8 years ago, that research has been in place. And truth to say, for about the first 30 years of that, nobody was interested in the slightest. It's a bit dispiriting when you work through a whole lot of your career and you're told by your senior officials in the department, take those trees out, they're a waste of time, nobody's interested in. Fortunately, I managed to slip things under the radar and the trees stayed. And thanks to EU funding for projects, and thanks to our link with Queen's University, where we were able to get students to work on the research and provide results that were least interesting to people. If you kept quiet about the loss of land at Loughgall under those trees, we managed to survive. And those are the sort of benefits that silvopasture, I mean, it's sort of common sense. Everybody knows the trees are good for wildlife, they're good for the soil, they're good for carbon. But when you start to look at how trees interact with animals, then it gets really interesting because they're also good for animals, and welfare of animals is increasingly important in the food production systems that we have, and I'll talk a bit about that later on. So, as I said, 40 years ago, really, our evidence base was to try and make grassland farming more sustainable in Northern Ireland, and by increasing tree cover. And we set up, in conjunction with 8 other sites around the UK, this trial where we compared grassland on its own, mostly perennial ryegrass pasture, with woodland, which was just trees planted in normal, high density, a normal woodland situation, not grazed. And then open space trees. We planted them at 400 trees per hectare. It was the best distance we came up with eventually. But that was where we were growing trees in grassland managed with all the normal ways, but except that there were trees grazing them with it. So what have we learnt? Had we learnt over that period? And almost forgotten, if you like. It's a bit like the Clover story. There's an awful lot of knowledge stacked up in Clover. There are shelves full of it, and it's all there to be taken out and looked at. So we've had, if you like, 36 years or so of this comparing grassland, silvopasture, and silvo-arable systems in a range of scenarios. And those are just some of the sort of pictures of the work that has gone on, mainly at Loughgall, but some of it also on the bottom right picture on a hill farmer we worked with in County Antrim at Ian Gibson's, where Ian and I were queens together, and he let me use his farm to do the replicate trial of what we'd done at Loughgall to do on a challenging environment in the Antrim Hills. But the principles are the same, the soil benefits, the impact on the animals and everything else. So that's our a couple of pictures there of the site at Loughgall. The ones on your left, anyway, that was it probably about 15 years ago, and that's just a couple of years ago. So we proved that you could do it. The trees could be grown at wide spacing. The farmer could manage the land. He could do whatever he wanted to do, sow fertilizers, put slurry, top weeds, anything like that. And you could work around that. The trees grew perfectly well in the system. They grew exceptionally well, actually, and that was something new we found. I must say, in those days, none of us were I'm not a forester. I was sort of sheep grazing was my speciality. No forester was interested in the slightest in this system in all of the parts of the UK we worked with, which was a shame because we could have managed those trees far better. Now we know we have foresters on board, and we are showing that if you prune those trees, if you put a bit of effort into them, you can get a really good financial return from them. So that was something we've learned along the way now that the system has sort of become accepted. Those are just some of the examples of systems that we have at Loughgall. The poplar there were sown as a silvo-arable trial, now grassed down and going to be used for shading trials with new varieties of grassland and perhaps multi-species swards. So AFBI are taking forward a lot of that work which is on, at Loughgall. And in the bottom picture there, wild cherry. Fortunately, about 10 years ago, we planted, a student of mine, Rodrigo Olave, planted wide space cherry to look at the form of cherry, look at could we improve cherry as a quality tree, a timber producing tree. Now we used ash all around them as a nurse. Ash dieback hadn't come in then, it did. We removed the ash, and very fortunately now we have a really exciting silvo pasture. Cherry trees have been pruned 2 or 3 times because it was foresters were behind the trial, and we really have trees that will be of tremendous value, and they're still able to graze. There's cattle on them at the minute, and of pasture below them. And the sycamore trial at the bottom there, on the upland farm I was talking about, the farmer still has his trees there after 30 years. He's able to outwinter Galloways and blackface sheep. And that land there was rushy pasture before we started, and now look, it's a good sward. The animals get the benefit of the shade and shelter under the sheep. So we showed that the system worked. It gave us all those benefits that I've mentioned: biodiversity, carbon sequestration, and so on. Agroforestry and soil health, a big focus of today, and regenerative farming. Agroforestry brings huge benefits to soil health. The tree roots go down, they open up the soil, and healthy soils, as we know, are more climate resilient. This is from Clive Bright's trial, who thinks should have been here today, he couldn't make it, where he has planted trees on a very wet, heavy soil in County Sligo. On the left there you have he planted trees, and after 7 or 8 years, alder trees, he put animals into those, and now he has a function. The rushes have gone, the soil is productive, and you have a very healthy animal production system. And it's really had a tremendous effect. We've talked about the tree bit. The pasture bit is equally important. I think that's where going ahead in silvopast in this agroforestry work, it's integrating what we know about pastures, and it goes right back to the sort of stuff Patrick was talking about. Your multi-species swards, what are they doing below the ground? What are they doing above the ground? How do they interact with the tree canopy? And how can we maximize a biological system from that? We've talked about we've talked about climate extremes. There's, all you'll remember, 2018, July, August, with no rain, and the grass growth that almost completely collapsed in Ireland, and that's that's going to become the norm. The last 2 years, if we look, we've had below average grass growth. People said to me in 2018, "What about your silvopasture trees, Jim? I'm sure those pastures are bone dry and brown and dead." But that was our the agroforestry in August 2018, where there was just grass only. The grass was practically dead. But under the trees, the grass stayed green because of the shade, the shelter, and the reduction in evapotranspiration. And the trees did well. Tree fodder is another aspect. You can see old records of how people did feed branches of trees to animals and how it improved their health. People knew that trees like willow and alder had a great benefit to tree health, and now we're getting the evidence from that, looking at mineral analyses and all of able to show that, yes, that's right. And more importantly, recently, reducing methane emissions and helping us to deal with the sort of the greenhouse gas crisis. Animal welfare, I'll just finish up with, which is a very, very important topic in terms of our food production system. And it makes sense that having trees there, having a diversity of a habitat is going to be better system for animal welfare. Animals have a more varied diet, and it extends the length of the grazing season up to 15, 16 weeks perhaps. We're finding you can keep animals out of a house. They're healthier, they're producing less ammonia, and you have better grazing system. And there's evidence, as I said, of their benefits for their gut health and everything else. Pig and poultry units lend themselves very much to integrating into trees. The hen is a woodland bird and performs very well in that type of scenario. And you can grow a valuable crop of timber, fruit, or nuts, or whatever. So just to finish with a quote really from Clive Bright, who is really one of the big advocates of silvopasture in the south of Ireland. "Where nature thrives is a great place for livestock to live," and he's a great cattle farmer to be seen there. And we have support from the Irish Agroforestry Forum to put that out. So we need to really promote agroforestry across the island, even if not everybody wants to listen. But that's what it's always been like in history, isn't it? So thank you.